the immune and lymphatic systems. I only put immune system on the frontispiece for the PowerPoint because it really is the case that the lymphatic system is in support of multiple other systems. So if you think about, we talked about lacteals when we did the digestive system, and we talked about lymphatic vessels returning excess tissue fluid to the cardiovascular system. So we're going to focus with the lymphatic system on how the lymphatic system organs participate in immunity. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show this little video. It's not terribly long, but it sort of sets the stage in a real world context for why, or the sort of the many ways that the immune system intersects with our lives. Pardon my French.
Insulin pumps improve the lives of many of the 415 million people with diabetes around the world by monitoring blood sugar, delivering insulin, and preventing the need for constant finger pricking and blood testing. These small machines include a pump and a needle, which can sense glucose levels, feed back to the pump, and then calculate how much insulin to deliver through the needle. But they have a catch. They're temporary. Within a few days, glucose sensors have to be moved and replaced. And it's not just glucose monitors and insulin pumps that have this problem, but all bodily implants at different timescales. Plastic prosthetic knees have to be replaced after about 20 years. Other implants, such as those used for cosmetic reasons, can meet the same fate in about 10. That isn't just a nuisance, it can be expensive and risky. This inconvenience happens because of our body's immune systems. Honed by several 100 million years of evolution, these defensive fronts have become exceptionally good at identifying foreign objects. Our immune systems boast an impressive arsenal of tools to tackle, intercept, and destroy anything they believe shouldn't be there. But the consequence of this constant surveillance is that our bodies treat helpful implants, like insulin pumps, with the same suspicion as they would a harmful virus or bacteria. As soon as the insulin pump has been implanted in the skin, its presence triggers what's known as a foreign body response. This starts with free-floating proteins that stick themselves to the surface of the implant. Those proteins include antibodies, which attempt to neutralize the new object and send out a signal that calls other immune cells to the site to strengthen the attack. Early responding inflammatory cells, like neutrophils and macrophages, respond to the emergency call. Neutrophils release little granules filled with enzymes that try to break down the surface of the insulin pump's needle. Macrophages secrete enzymes too, together with nitric oxide radicals, which create a chemical reaction that degrades the object over time. If the macrophages are unable to dispatch the foreign body rapidly, they fuse together, forming a mass of cells called a giant cell. At the same time, cells called fibroblasts travel to the site and begin to deposit layers of dense connective tissue. Those enclose the needle that the pump uses to deliver insulin and test for glucose levels. Over time, this scaffolding builds up, forming a scar around the implant. The scar functions as an almost impenetrable wall that might start to block vital interactions between the body and the implant. For example, scarring around pacemakers can interrupt the electrical transmission that's crucial for their functioning. Synthetic knee joints may give off particles as they're worn down, causing immune cells to inflame around these fragments. Tragically, the immune system's attack can even be life-threatening. However, researchers are finding ways to trick the immune system into accepting the new devices we introduce into our bodily tissues. We've discovered that coating implants with certain chemicals and drugs can dampen the immune response. Those basically make the implant invisible to the immune system. We're also making more implants out of natural materials and in forms that directly mimic tissues, so that the body launches a weaker attack than it would if it came across a completely artificial implant. Some medical treatments involve implants designed to regenerate lost or damaged tissues. In those cases, we can design the implants to contain ingredients that will release specific signals and carefully tailor our body's immune reactions. In the future, this way of working alongside the immune system could help us develop completely artificial organs, totally integrated prostheses, and self-healing wound therapies. These treatments might one day revolutionize medicine and transform forever the bodies we live in. If you'd like to learn more about how the immune system protects your body, check out this video.
One thing that it leaves out that we've just learned has to do with the importance of our body's own what's called microbiome or microbiota. So the bacteria, fungi, and viruses that co-evolved with us and that actually help to train our immune system to be appropriately responsive. An allergy is a hypersensitivity or hyperimmune response to something that's not in and of itself dangerous. I'm not saying, if you have a peanut allergy that one should go eat peanuts, but that there's nothing inherently harmful about peanuts unless your immune system decides that there is. So that's one of the reasons why at this point I sometimes start to talk about our bodies as a colony organism or superorganism, because if you just go by number, we have far more bacterial and fungal cells than human cells in our bodies, and those are not pathogens, so they are not disease-causing materials. We also have about, the last time I looked, about 100 times as many bacterial genes as we have human genes, and the products of those genes and the products of those bacteria contribute to our health. So that's my sort of pitch for not seeing all microbes as pathogenic. Okay, so path means disease, or actually sadness, but so I guess a pathogen is something that generates sadness, literally, but figuratively we use it to mean something that generates disease. Microbes are any number of things that aren't visible to our eyes without a microscope or an electron microscope. And they fall into two classes: cellular, which are living things, and then acellular, which are non-living. So 3 of the 4 classes of living things are eukaryotic cells. So parasites, which are multicellular and range from anything from a tapeworm, which can end up being quite large, to really tiny helminths, which are always microscopic. Protozoa, which is another way of describing protists, so they're single-celled organisms that have complex eukaryotic cell structure. And then fungi, which can be anything from Tinea, which causes athlete's foot and jock itch, to Candida, some species of which cause yeast infections. So thrush is a yeast infection in the mouth that you sometimes see in nursing infants. All of those, because they're eukaryotes, if they are pathogens, they're much more difficult to get rid of than prokaryotes like bacteria. I don't know of archaea that actually infect humans. They tend to specialize in really extreme environments, and our body is not extreme in the same way that a pool of boiling acid at Yosemite might be. So eukaryotes are harder, when they're pathogens, are harder for us to treat because their cells share so many more similarities with us. Bacteria, you can use antibiotics on, and usually we use the term antibiotic specifically to refer to drugs that or compounds that target prokaryotes. They have different cell surface molecules, different enough that it's possible for us to design drugs that can get inside the cell and kill it or stop it from reproducing without damaging our own eukaryotic cells. The acellular microbes that are pathogenic include a whole range of viruses, and it's a very impressive looking virus. That's actually a bacteriophage, which is a virus that infects bacteria, because everything is both predator and prey on Earth, it seems, anything. So these viruses infect bacteria, and they're actually being co-opted now to treat drug-resistant bacterial infections. There are other viruses, none of which look like an alien spaceship, that like the coronavirus, the new coronavirus, like HIV, like herpes, influenza, the adenoviruses that cause colds, can infect human cells. Infecting a human cell requires the ability of the virus to insert its genetic material into a human cell of one kind or another. Different cells have different cell surface proteins, even in the same person. So viruses tend to specialize in a single cell type. Poliovirus specifically and only infects motor neurons, and that's responsible for the pattern of symptoms you see with polio, which is paralytic. Viruses are much harder to treat than living pathogens, because until recently we didn't have any effective drugs. Viruses are a tremendous amount smaller. Even the largest are a lot smaller than bacteria. So we've only really, for the last 60 years or so, been able to image them and study them in a way that would allow us to develop drugs. The prions, or prions, depending on where you're from in the country, are infectious proteins. And to me, these are the scariest because they are the most difficult to disable. So viruses, particularly viruses that have a lipid outer coat, are really susceptible to common cleaning products like alcohol. Prions are essentially misfolded proteins that are infectious. And what we mean by that is that once they are in a particular part of the body, they can cause this sort of domino effect where they cause all kinds of other proteins to suddenly tumble out of shape and be denatured. There's a suite of different kinds of disorders that are associated with these crazy things, but the one most people are familiar with is mad cow disease, which can lead to something called soft Jacob disease in humans, and it's essentially causes dementia. The problem with studying it is that in humans you can be infected and not actually see the effects for years afterwards. So after all of that terrifying stuff, again, I have to say most microbes are in fact harmless. Most of them don't want to have anything to do with us. They specialize in the living ones, and the viruses specialize in other life forms. And prions, I'm unsure if we know exactly what they want or if it's just a fluke of evolution that they do what they do. So I promised we were going to talk about the lymphatics. So we talked about how the lymphatic system participates with the cardiovascular system in fluid balance in the body. And it does that because lymphatic capillaries are leaky, and so they are fluid sink, or a drain, essentially, if you will, for excess tissue fluid that is where there's not enough time for it to be reabsorbed into vascular capillaries. We talked about lacteals in the digestive system that are the way that we're able to absorb nonpolar fatty acids and other important lipids from our diet. And then finally, what we're going to talk about now, which is the lymphatic system helping the immune system. So we talked about lymphatic vessels a fair amount. Now we're going to focus on lymphatic organs. And lymphatic organs are broken down into primary and secondary. So the white blood cells that are a constituent of both the immune system and the lymphatic system are called lymphocytes, you might guess from the name. They are formed initially, they're all born in red bone marrow. Some of them learn about the world around us in red bone marrow. Others migrate to an organ called the thymus, which sits just above the heart and is fairly small in adults. They get their education about the world in the thymus. Then we have secondary organs that essentially provide graduate school. So if you think of red bone marrow as the nursery for all lymphocytes, and then red bone marrow or thymus as being high school, secondary lymphatic organs are college and graduate school. So the lymph nodes and the spleen are those. They're also what are called lymphatic nodules, and I'll explain that difference in a sec. Primary lymphatic organs. Red bone marrow produces all of the different formed elements of blood, including white blood cells. And white blood cells are a kind, or lymphocytes are a kind of white blood cell. Cells that are called B cells, or B lymphocytes, more properly, mature in bone marrow. So they go to high school in bone marrow, whereas T lymphocytes go to high school, sort of a boarding school, which is the thymus. One of the reasons why kids tend to have stronger immune reactions than adults do has to do with the amount of red bone marrow. So the older we are, the less red marrow we have in our long bones. So the thymus is the other primary lymphatic organ, and you can see the upper panel. I tried to scale these. I couldn't find a similar drawing of both. So we've got the pericardium, right, and the lungs. The pericardium is covering the heart. And in kids, the thymus is really ginormous. It's a bilobe structure. It's a little asymmetrical, and that's one way to distinguish it from the thyroid gland. The other way is that the thyroid gland wraps around the larynx, and this is just above the heart. It is much, much larger in children and young adults. And that's where the T lymphocytes are going to college. And T lymphocytes are absolutely critical to the immune response. They're one of the primary ways that our immune system knows self from non-self. And if you think about it for a second, for an immune system to work, it has to recognize things that are foreign. Sometimes it recognizes our own body tissues as being foreign, and that's what we call an autoimmune disease. Other times we have hypersensitive reactions to things that aren't dangerous, which is an allergy. And sometimes T lymphocytes don't think anything is a problem because usually those are genetic syndromes, or they're induced by viruses like HIV. When we think about coronavirus and you think about the sort of, okay, people age 60 and up have a much higher risk for serious disease, and they're much more likely to be diagnosed or to test positive, as well as to have serious disease. If you look at the thymus, the mass of the thymus here, you start to understand why. It's also the case that both the thymus and the bacteria in our intestines play roles in educating the immune system about what's dangerous. And the more different kinds of environments a child is exposed to early in life, the less likely they are to have allergies and autoimmune disease as young adults and adults. And we think that's because, if you grow up living with animals in the house and you're allowed to play in the dirt and eat a wide variety of food, and food is, no matter how careful you are to wash any kind of raw food, you will ingest bacteria. And that bacteria can actually be really good for you in terms of, if it makes it down to the colon, it can help diversify the overall population of bacteria. Sort of many more species in the colon translates into a healthier individual. Okay, so secondary lymphatic organs. First, we're going to talk about the spleen. So the spleen is in the upper left of the abdominal cavity. In this image, you can see, right, we've got the esophagus and the stomach here, and the spleen. The other thing you would see in real life is that the pancreas sort of pokes its tail and into the spleen. Not that it's directly connected to it, it's just in terms of how the anatomy is organized. The spleen is incredibly vascular. That's why it's always drawn as purple. It's also the case that, unlike the kidneys, which have this lovely connective tissue capsule in the highly vascular kidneys, the spleen doesn't have that. And in part, that may be an accident of evolution, but you can certainly construct a story where, if you are an organ that is essentially, you're full of different kinds of immune cells, that part of the organ's job is to act as sort of a lookout post for unusual objects that you might see either in the lymphatic vessels, because it's full of lymphatic vessels as well, unusual substances that might be in the bloodstream. Because it doesn't have this capsule, it's very subject to rupturing. That's especially true if you've had a disease like mononucleosis, which leads to enlargement of the spleen that makes it more likely to rupture. So kids who have a mono, which is caused by Epstein-Barr virus, they are not supposed to do any kind of contact sport, including things like soccer. Anything that could potentially lead to them somehow falling on or being whacked with directly or on purpose or not on purpose, anything that could cause their spleen to rupture for a minimum of 6 months. So if we look inside the spleen, what we see is that there are two really distinct areas, white pulp and red pulp. So the white pulp is it's white because it's full of white blood cells, so it's really important for surveilling lymph and blood. And the red pulp's function is to pull old red blood cells out of circulation, because remember, they only live for about 3 months. It also can pull microorganisms, so it can pull microbes out of the blood. The term antigen means, in this context, some kind of particle, usually a cell surface molecule, that is foreign to the body and can stimulate an immune response. The red pulp is also a reserve of blood, and it's part of that process, along with the liver, of recycling components of red blood cells. So we've got primary organs, red bone marrow, and the thymus. Secondary organs, we've got the spleen, lymph nodes, and then lymphatic nodules. So lymph nodes have a fibrous capsule around the outside. They're vaguely oval shaped. And as you can sort of see in these two diagrams, you find them in very high concentrations in areas of the body that are in close contact with the external world. the areas that are that have the highest exposure to the external world actually have lymphatic nodules. So you dispense with the capsule around the lymphatic tissue, and that makes it easier for the tissue to be sampling material as it goes by. So lymph nodes, we have a lot of them. They're filled with B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and macrophages. And each lymph node acts sort of like an oil filter. So an oil filter in a car, as cars run, at least the typical combustion engines, you have these metal cylinders that have rods moving up and down, and that's what eventually drives the wheels on the bus around and around. Over time, well, first of all, you need oil as a lubricant there. And over time, really tiny particles of metal flake off into the oil. The oil filter catches those and keeps them from essentially destroying the engine. Lymph nodes are very similar. You have lymph flowing in through afferent vessels, right? So afferent, again, means approaching into each little segment of a lymph node in section. They look almost like a citrus fruit. And you've essentially the macrophages, the T cells, well, the B cells and the T cells are the cells that are going to recognize that there's something that needs to be pulled out. And then the macrophage's job is to gobble it up. There's multiple afferent vessels moving in and a single efferent vessel coming out. That efferent vessel may split, but initially emerging from the lymph node, there's only one of them. And there you can sort of see in this diagram, there's some valves as well that the lymph from flowing backwards. And swollen lymph nodes, which are usually, if you have a cold or a bacterial infection in your throat, you'll have swollen lymph nodes that you feel in your neck. The cervical lymph nodes swell. And that's because the immune system is capable of upregulating the number of white blood cells in a matter of hours in response to an infection. Okay, so lymphatic nodules. I said before, they're similar to lymph nodes. The difference is that they're not surrounded by a capsule. And there are two examples that we cover. The first are the tonsils, and there's a whole ring of tonsils associated with the oral cavity. Pharyngeal tonsils, which are also called adenoids, are the ones that are usually removed if somebody has chronic sore throat. And then the small intestine is full of, in the wall of the small intestine, sort of built into the small intestine, are structures referred to as Peyer's patches that are lymphatic nodules. Okay, you've got a ring of tonsils around the pharynx. And this image, right, is showing adenoids, the palatine tonsils, which are associated with the roof of the mouth. And, again, if you think about sort of structure and function relationships, and you think about humans before the last, say, 150 years, before we had what passes or has passed for modern medicine, our food, first of all, we didn't have antibiotics until the Second World War, at least not widely available. And we didn't have a food processing and delivery system that made food spoilage, which essentially is another word for saying you have bacteria and fungi that are making a living on the food before you can make a living on it. We ate food for most of our evolutionary history that was coated with bacteria and viruses, some of which are pathogenic. So having capsulous lymphatic tissue associated with the oral cavity and the pharynx is just brilliant, because that's the first place that we encounter a lot of pathogens, right? Also, any pathogens that you inhale are going to be passing some of the tonsillar structures as well. And that tissue can then not just sort of sample what's happening and send out an alert, but can also phagocytize pathogens as well. So Peyer's patches are in the wall of the small intestine and also the appendix. It turns out the appendix actually does have a function in the immune system, and there are certain disorders that you see with higher frequency in people who've had their appendices removed. It's not to say if a physician says it needs to come out, you should say no, because you can die if you have a burst appendix of a systemic infection. It's just to say we now know they are important. So the smaller image on the left is a cross section through small intestine. So you have the lumen of the small intestine, you have the mucosa, and the Peyer's patches are the light color structures in the submucosa. So submucosa here is the more blue as opposed to purple structure. And then you've got the muscularis layers and the serosa around the outside. And here we're super up close and personal. So this would be the lumen. We've got the mucosa, the submucosa, and there's one of the Peyer's patches that I put the red oval around. Then we've got one muscularis layer, the circular layer, the longitudinal layer. So those cells would be coming up out of the screen at us, and then the serosa, the visceral peritoneum there. So again, right, where does all absorption, except for drugs and alcohol and water, happen in the digestive system? Via the small intestine. So this is another place where it's helpful to have embedded lymphatic tissue that doesn't have a capsule that walls it off from anything that's passing through this area. And remember that within the submucosa, that's where the capillaries, the vascular and lymphatic capillaries are. Okay, so this is a really good summary slide for lymphatic structures. And it also, in addition to showing you lymph nodes, you've got lymphatic capillaries there, as well as the thymus, lots of lymph nodes, the spleen, Peyer's patches, red bone marrow, and the adenoids are in fact tonsillar. And then you have the duct that the lymphatic vessels dump into before the heart.